Hello friends out in YouTube land. Here's hoping that you don't have malaria or worms. Yeah. Well, because who wants tapeworms? But if you have treatments for tapeworms, post them in the comment section. I'd love to see it.
Oh my gosh.
Do you think that'll actually happen?
Yes.
No, it might. We've still been getting a lot of herpes comments.
Yeah.
I love
They're
that.
commenting about their herpes. They're
Yes.
going to comment about this.
Yes. Regardless,
Oh,
believe me, these colon blow type treatments and things. So, all right, but no, malaria is not a gut worm. Malaria is actually it's an intracellular within the cell parasite, and infecting parts of the red blood cell system or the circulatory system. And it has a whole range of different kinds of symptoms and stuff. It is actually the plasmodia is being transferred by mosquitoes, and so you don't treat malaria particularly by trying to treat individuals with malaria, or a vaccine doesn't work very well, partly because the parasite actually gets inside the cell. And so you don't really have the immune surveillance. And then it's even wrapped up in the host cell membrane when it's out. And there's a whole range of coat proteins. And so it is the perfect example of the Red Queen notion of running as fast as you can just to stay where you are, that the host is doing. The host is trying to generate an immune response, and just as fast as it gets an immune response going, the guy changes his coat proteins, and now the immune response doesn't work anymore. Thank you very much. So really, the best prevention is killing the mosquitoes. So that's why we try to limit the amount of freestanding water. There are non-invasive, pesticides, like little discs and things you can drop into standing water that will be non-toxic to humans and to other animals. There are some drugs, chloroquine and quinine-based drugs are pretty good, but then there are increasing resistant malaria strains, and so the drugs work until the malaria strains become resistant, and then they don't work very well. And so, in the same way that antibiotics happen, is that these guys are able to shift fairly well, not through plasmids or anything, but just through mutation. So it is a fairly serious problem. A couple of other kinds of internal parasites, eukaryotic cells. Sleeping sickness, which is happily not something we have to worry about too much around here. It is primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, found in humans, but pigs and cows and other large mammals also can carry it. It's a fairly slow development, but it is pretty much lethal. And it is a multicellular little guy known as a trypanosome. Trypanosome brucei is the primary causative agent of sleeping sickness. And similar to other kinds of viruses and things, it's carried by a very specific vector, and that is the tsetse fly, which of course is not around here. They bite and inject the trypanosome, and trypanosomes are actually one of the first organisms, I think, that the antigenic coat shift was discovered in that they alternate their external proteins. And essentially, you can have a trypanosome that is lighting up the immune system. And there's, immune proteins, the antibodies are binding to it, and then it'll change its proteins and essentially shrug them off and start back up again. And so it's pretty much impossible for a host to develop a good immune response to it. So it is primarily located where the tsetse fly is. If you don't have the fly, you don't have the problem. So that's nice. It's also, there is no kind of vaccine or things for it. So again, the number one thing you do is control mosquitoes, sleep under a sleeping net or a mosquito net, and wear DEET. Yeah. So these are a couple of the different stages of the progression. So you have the initial bite, and then early there's headaches, joint pain, itching, known as Winterbottom's sign. Colonial British were being exposed to this and dying off, which is one of the reasons why it's actually was initially studied. You probably can treat it fairly well at these early stages, but if not, it starts to get into the major organs, and eventually the neurological phase is when it's getting into the brain. You have progressive, irreversible mental decline, leading finally to coma and death. And so the confusion results in sort of a manic and then depressive states, daytime slumber and nighttime insomnia, which is where it gets its name from. Not a particularly pleasant kind of disease to be involved with, thank you very much. There are probably prophylactic treatments you can take that isn't going to prevent it. Here's another blood disease that actually I'd never heard of until I started reading through this, babesiosis. And this is another one of those zoonotic types. Actually, one of the questions that a lot of people were missing, and it's one of the things I want to make sure I'm am I down with this definition. But the reservoir is a guy that is not being particularly affected by the disease. They're able to be infected, but not actually have a whole lot of symptoms. And so the mouse is a pretty good reservoir. Ticks are a pretty good vector. Humans are not part of the life cycle. The organism can't replicate within the human, but it does have it affects in humans. And so it's pretty much up in the northeastern seaboard of the U.S. And it is infecting red blood cells. So you have headache, anemia, and again, tick control is how you manage this. There may be contamination in blood, and blood donations would be a way that you could actually transmit it. And so, I don't know, I've never traveled to the eastern seaboard during the summertime where they ask me a question about that, but that may be a thing that if you're up there and you're getting blood donations, they may actually talk to you about it. It's a major thing. The little white-footed mouse, the Peromyscus, is one of the major reservoirs of this. He's not bothered by it so much. The tick is on him. Tick picks up the infected erythrocytes and then can transmit it around. Ticks. Ugh, don't like them. All right, another blood disease, toxoplasmosis, or toxoplasmosis. This is another intracellular parasite, that is inside the cell. And it's fairly common in the U.S. So in places where it is endemic, it actually can be really, really common and generally not known. We know that domestic cats are the host. It's actually found in the oocysts are in cat poop. And organisms might ingest the cat poop. That's why it's not a good idea to let your dog eat various sorts of excrement. Thank you to Twinkle. It then can get into muscles and things and infect organisms that would then eat that animal. Mild flu-like symptoms, if you're immune compromised, there are some problems, but otherwise it's not too much of a serious issue. So it's one of the reasons why people that are immune compromised and probably pregnant women shouldn't be cleaning out the litter box. On the other hand, I don't have a cat, I've never had a cat that used a litter box, and so I'm not sure what to make of that. Anyway, when I was growing up, we had our cat Fritzy, who lived forever, but she just hung outside and then would come in and sleep on my brother's bed. But I never was associated with a cat litter box sort of lifestyle. And then when I moved into the Great North, that's what, everybody has their litter boxes down in the basement or whatever, and I'm like, oh God. Yeah. So, whatever. So the cat is a reservoir, and in this case, the cat's not particularly bothered by it. The cat is pooping out the oocytes in its feces. Little organisms are picking these up, and you can then have either meat contaminated because of prey and things. You can have contaminated foods. So, yeah, A, don't put your litter box in the kitchen. B, change your litter box regularly. C, don't have cats. There you go. Again, the animals are often infected by consuming the oocysts, contaminated meat, or if it's soil, things like that. And the cyst can release the form called the tachyzoite within the infected area. So they are able to kind of maintain this cycle. Thank you very much. All right, so one of the main concerns is what is known as toxoplasmosis. And toxoplasmosis is particularly troublesome during pregnancy and with fetal development. Specifically, it can cause hydrocephalus, which is abnormal fluid on the brain, which then results in a variety of neurological issues, blindness, severe mental retardation, a variety of things. In the adult, you have a range of different kinds of symptoms and things. So not a good idea to have the litter box being left alone where it dries out and can then aerosolize in small particles, and probably have somebody else clean your litter box. As we all know, the cats, if they leave on your chest, they suck the breath out of you. So, all right. So, on to a different class of parasites, worms. So, these are known as helminthic parasites. And we've got a couple of helminthic endoparasites. The liver fluke, known as a trematode, Fasciola hepatica. Schistosoma mansonii is another fluke, and it's also classified as a nematode. There is the ever popular tapeworm, which can be very, very long. Then there are things, the roundworm nematode, and a variety of different kinds of worms, and different ways they get into you, and different places they can encyst and land. So these guys often have fairly complicated life cycles. So here is a tapeworm. They can be awfully long. And this is always, if you take a parasitology class with a helmet biologist, they'll always have all the stories of phenomenally long tapeworms that they have seen or heard of, up to 25 meters in length. That's a pretty big guy, 75 feet, coiled up in your intestines. I wonder if you'd notice that. You're probably going to have some kind of bowel difficulties. I'm not sure. Probably not much, unless they block the intestines, and then you're going to know it pretty fast. But otherwise, it probably results in slight weight loss or reduction in general viability, but not all that much. They've got a head part that's called the scolex, and that attaches to the small intestine. And there are other parts, the reproductive organs are behind it, that then generate these essentially eggs, the proplodids, and they are released with the poop. Now, they don't have a lot of other systems, and one of the things with these guys is they're able to reproduce asexually, because the chances of meeting another tapeworm in the gut is pretty small.
Did you have a science requirement for your finance, did you say?
Yeah, so anybody who falls in the Bachelor of Science, and I think all Millikan students, they do one of your
But the door was not locked, so I knew you'd be able to get back in. So, with tapeworms, and same thing actually with guys like earthworms, which are not helmets, but other kinds of and different nematodes. They live a pretty solitary life, a pretty monastic life, and so the chance of them meeting up with somebody and being able to hook up is pretty slim. So that consequently, they're able to actually reproduce asexually. They have both egg and sperm production, which probably allows for some recombination events, but it's not like anything great. It is mostly clonal. So they're able to reproduce this way. So they're not too serious an issue. The idea that they can be used as a weight loss system, maybe. They actually have been used in this way. You get a pill that you take that has the cysts, and they essentially hatch open in your intestine and latch in, and you've got all kinds of effects. Now, I think this one is a bit of a sarcastic point, but back in the early part of the 20th century, late part of the 19th century, there were tapeworms that are sanitized and actually for your own consumption. The notion that they would potentially reduce the caloric intake, the amount they do is fairly minimum, though, so I'm not sure how much it's useful. It's not a particularly nice health issue, though. And so dogs can end up with an array of tapeworms. Humans too. You might have a tapeworm in your small intestine, 8 to 11 feet long, and never really know it. So the life cycle is actually an interesting kind of operation. The scolex attaches to the intestine, and then you begin shedding the eggs, and depending, one of the reasons why spraying sewage onto fields, maybe not the best thing you could do, certainly if it's not treated sewage. The animals ingest it. We have our little friend here is the intermediate host. Then the eggs inside him are hatching into larvae, and then they can begin to move into muscle cells. And from there, the pig is slaughtered. The cysts can survive in raw or undercooked meat. So that's yet another reason why eating raw meat perhaps is not the greatest thing for your health. You ingest it, and it then gets into your intestine. And there are a couple of different places, depending on the kind of tapeworm, where they can actually begin migrating up and getting into the lungs. And it's one of the things that with like dogs, and so we were ragging on cats, now we can rag on dogs. They can get the tapeworms by the fact that they can be through the lungs and into the saliva. The cysts, and the mom is licking the dog, licking the little one, and then they can ingest it and continue this, which is why dogs are treated for worms, particularly like if you have a dog from a shelter, they treat them for worms pretty easily. the treatment is actually fairly straightforward in that you ingest a compound that will act as a paralytic to the tapeworm, and you then poop the fella out. So here are dog tapeworms specifically, and if left untreated, they can actually start to generate some problems in the livers and things. So you've got an intermediate host, a whole range of different guys, sheep, goat, various swine, and they're ingesting in the feces. Then the cysts are ingested in by the dog, and you have then the life cycle going on. And so it is able, because it does get into the lungs and get into the saliva, or like when you cough up the mucus. And it's one of the things that they say, me and Quinkle kiss all the time, and that's all there is to it. But it's not necessarily the healthiest thing with a dog you don't know to kiss them on the lips. Just another one of those rules that you have to follow. All right, so this is another class, the trematodes. And these are known as liver flukes, and that's because they are found in some of the major organs like the liver, also found in the gallbladder and some of the different ducts and things. And they can have a little bit of a problem. This is often brought in by eating fish, which are, and this is part of the life cycle biz, the fish get infected by a larval form that is generated by a snail that ate the original egg. And that's one of the things with parasites, is they can often have this phenomenally complicated life cycle to the point that you think, how are they actually able to survive? But they do. And so you have to have a very specific species of snail in the stream that is then picking up the larval form, and is like, snails? Why snails? And they then are producing eggs that they can, whatever, slime into the water. The fish eat them, and from there, you eat the fish. So you have inflammation of the liver, bile duct. It can cause liver to increase in size. Loss of bile, which then is in turn going to reduce your ability to digest fats. And so you can end up with a range of different kinds of digestive disorders, diarrhea, unpleasantness, potentially bile duct obstruction, which actually is going to probably require surgery. They can live a very long time, and they produce eggs. We don't really have great drugs for dealing with these things. And so here is the life cycle. And as I said, it's actually kind of ridiculous in that we've got eggs pass the feces, of course. The eggs are ingested by the snail, and inside the snail, they actually go through a series of steps. The Myrissidia undergoes differentiation into the sporocyst, the radiae, the cercaria are the infective form that are then being dumped out into the water, and the cercaria actually can swim around a little bit. And what are known as the metacercaria are in the flesh. And so you have the infection happening. It gets into the large or the small intestine, and from there it can actually make its way into a couple of different organs. So the best point here is if you're going to eat sushi, make sure it is prepared properly. The way that you can treat sushi fish is to freeze it, because the metacercaria are pretty sensitive to cold, and they are no longer viable after freezing. So that is the primary way. Really fresh fish, yes, but probably a freezing treatment. We eat a fair amount of sushi, and we actually have eaten sushi from fish that we have caught in Lake Superior. But when we did consume it, we took the fillets and put them up in the -70 for a couple of days, and then took them out and consumed them. And so I only hope that any fish that I have consumed raw has gone through some kind of freeze-thaw cycle. I don't want no damn worms. Anyway, all right, so schistosomiasis is a chronic intestinal disease, and it's actually fairly invasive and fairly common, particularly in the third world. So we were looking earlier at Schistosoma mansonii is a classic schistosome that is studied in terms of its ability to infect a whole range of folks. In developing countries, primarily it's going to be, dumping the eggs, or in the Myristidia, or the larvae, and the Metacercaria are getting dumped out into the environment through the poop. So they also have, for whatever reason, again, a snail-based life cycle. It is chronic, intestine, urinary tract, not typically fatal, but it can have some issues. You have abdominal pain, fever, diarrhea, fatigue. It takes a while. You can have then some issues with the colon and leading to bladder cancer as well, as it makes its way up into the kidneys. And rarely you can have central nervous system issues. So the eggs hatch, the larvae infect the snails. The snails then release the second larval stage. And in this case, these guys burrow through the skin into the human bloodstream. And so you can get into the lungs. From there, you can make its way to the liver, a whole range of different kinds of veins. And there are a range of different species that have slightly different kinds of pathways. There are antihelminthic drugs that can be used to treat this. But again, a pretty serious problem in parts of the world that don't have the greatest sanitation. So another one of these life cycles, and the passage through snails is a thing that is common to a lot of different organisms here. So we've got the Cercaria released by the snail into the water, and then in this case they're penetrating through the skin. The Cercaria then penetrate and circulate around, end up in the liver where they are able to actually mature, and they actually can carry out reproduction as different guys can differentiate into either males or females. And so it's sort of like, they are, what's the term? They can differentiate either sex. And depending on who they meet up with, they lay eggs that circulate the liver, and then they, of course, shed into the poop. And from there, it is picked up in the feces, also some in the urine, which is kind of like, damn. The eggs release in the water, and they're picked up by the snail. The snail then is carrying out the next step of replication and releasing the Cercaria into the water, and you're back to the races again. So a fairly complex life cycle that actually does work for this guy. All right, so now another kind of helminth. This is the nematode that causes pinworm. And again, some of these things, I look at this and go, oh God. I mean, it makes my hiney itch, but I don't want to talk about that. I didn't say that on video. But with little children, if they're itching their butthole, that's one of the things you suspect. Little children are great, wonderful vectors. So it is actually fairly common in the U.S. It's a fairly simple life cycle in this case. The adults release the eggs, they contaminate the soil, food, ingestion restarts the cycle. Reinfection happens. It is not particularly dangerous. You do end up with the old itchy butt. You might have a little bit of diarrhea. Treatment is fairly simple. There are the anti-helminths and metronidazole. Metronidazole? I've never taken it. One of the things you do is that it's important that you get the whole family treated because you don't want to maintain the infection cycle. So you have ingestion, the larvae hatch in the intestine, and from there they're making their way into the small intestine and the upper colon. And then from there, the worms that are actually now ready to lay eggs, they make their way to the rectum and finally out into your butthole. Thank you. It's not regular that as a molecular cell biologist that I actually get to use the term anus in class. But if you have an itchy butt, you didn't get it from me. Something you may have heard of, a disease that used to be fairly common, becoming now increasingly rare, and that's trichinosis. Again, it's a worm, and it is found in undercooked pork. And so now, pigs are the most common hosts. There are a few others. The eggs themselves are not infective. The meat is digested, and then the eggs hatch. The larvae encyst in muscles, and that's how they're able to maintain themselves. So the cysts end up in a range of different muscles. No real cure for it. It is an idea that this may have been part of the kosher dietary laws. So the ingestion of undercooked meat, especially pork, can result in the release of the larvae in the intestines. And from there, the larvae are making their way around. The encysted larvae are pretty much staying in the striated muscle. So you're not really serving as a great contaminant. It's primarily in rodents that are then, in some ways, getting into the pig. So meat scraps and detritus and such. So the CDC and the FDA, or I guess USDA, recommend that you cook pork to a temperature of about 140 degrees. It used to be like 180 degrees, which results in pretty darn dried, overcooked pork. And then, depending on what you read, 160 is just fine. 140 is probably on the low end. But that's why when you're cooking pork, it's not a bad idea to have a meat thermometer. It's easy to overcook your pork tenderloin, and there's no reason to. Once you hit, the 140, 150 mark, you're good. So we should, I enjoy my pork tenderloins and pork roasts, but I do cook them thoroughly. But not so much that they're dry. Don't do that. Other worms you've heard of, bookworms. This is another nematode. They hook into the intestinal lining. They suck blood. They can result in anemia if you have a heavy enough infection. In this case, the eggs do pass through the feces into the soil or water. They become larvae. And then the larvae can burrow through the feet and then make their way into the circulatory system. And this is one of those cases where it gets into the lungs, and then from the lungs, they're swallowed and they end up back in the intestine. These damn worms and parasites are odd creatures. And they're not like, a simple infection. The notion that you get into the lungs, you then have a bit of mucus hochneolugi that you then swallow, and that is how you get infected? I don't want it. Thank you. It's common in dogs and cats. It apparently is reasonably common in people, but I don't want to hear about it. It's actually fairly easily treated with a variety of different kinds of anti-worming things. And so if you have a dog, having them dewormed is something that can happen. And certainly if you pick up a dog that's a stray, that's what the things are going to do. Because dogs that are hanging out in the wild, they have a very good chance of having picked up intestinal worms. Oh boy. So, filariasis, transmitted between hosts by mosquitoes, a little bit like heartworms. And the worms end up in the lymphatic system, and they maintain the cycle this way. One of the problems with blocking the lymphatic system is, you know, or you may or may not know, you have venous blood that is bringing blood back up to the heart, and that's being pumped up by muscle contraction and things. And then a lot of the fluid that is in the blood is also being brought up back into the system, into the circulatory system, through the lymph glands. And so you've got a whole range of, when blood hits the capillary bed, it is being squeezed, and the capillary beds are fairly porous. The red blood cells don't pass into that, they just have oxygen exchange, but there's a fair amount of fluid that is being transmitted and transferred across, and this now has to drain back into the lymphatic system. You block the lymphatic system, and you end up looking like this poor fellow. I don't even want to think about it. So, it is particularly severe in the legs, the extremities, arms, the scrotum. Thank you very much. Again, one of these words that I don't tend to say a lot. It results in something known as elephantiasis. Yeah, just yet one more reason why I'm staying home. Yep, just I ain't leaving. All right. So in the lab, we're going to be doing some bacteriophage. I'll get a protocol out to you today and tomorrow. Some interesting dilutions and interesting ways of plating out bacteriophage. That is a lot of fun, and we'll see how that goes. All right. That's all I have to say.